So let's dig a layer deeper and talk about what is actually being traded here. On the surface, it is wheat. You see grain cars, silos, ports, container ships. But underneath, what is being traded is security, dependence, and leverage. Food is not just another commodity like copper or lumber, it is the material basis of life. When a country like China locks in a huge share of Canada's exportable wheat, it is buying more than calories. It is buying a measure of independence from the ups and downs of world markets dominated by the United States and its allies. When the United States throws around tariffs on that same wheat, it is trying to preserve a kind of imperial privilege, the privilege of deciding who gets what, when, and on what terms. Now, again, none of these actors will describe it this way. They will talk about market access, national interest, food security, fairness. But once you peel back the language, you see class interests at work. In Canada, large agribusiness firms, grain traders, shipping companies, and banks all stand to profit from a long-term premium-paying customer like China. They pressured their government, implicitly or explicitly, not to sit passively while Trump used Canadian farmers as props in his domestic political theater. They needed the Canadian state to defend their profitability, and the Canadian state did exactly that by pivoting eastward. In the United States, by contrast, there is a very different class configuration behind policy. Agribusiness in the U.S. is huge and powerful, but it is also internally divided. Export-oriented firms want stable access to global markets, including China. Domestically focused processors and certain grain interests want protection from foreign competition. Trump plays to one faction, those who want protection because they are electorally useful symbols, the family farmer, the heartland producer, supposedly besieged by foreign imports. Meanwhile, many of the largest capitalist players adapt behind the scenes, hedging, diversifying, setting up subsidiaries abroad, and making sure that whatever happens, their profits are insulated as much as possible. As the tragedy is that farmers themselves, as individuals and families, are pulled into these battles as pawns. Canadian farmers did not design the wheat pact with China, but their livelihoods now depend on it. American farmers did not write the tariff policy, but they must live with the consequences. Retaliatory measures, disrupted markets, roller coaster prices. They are told to cheer these moves as patriotic, even when the numbers on their balance sheets tell a different story. This is how ideology works in capitalism. It asks people to identify with a nation, a flag, a leader, instead of recognizing the class structure that actually shapes their lives. Ask yourself, who will truly be hurt if this wheat realignment becomes permanent? Not the billionaire owners of diversified global corporations. They will find new opportunities somewhere. Not the political operatives in Washington or Ottawa. They will craft fresh talking points for the next election. The people who will bear the brunt are those whose work is tightly tied to a specific place and industry. The mill worker in Minnesota, the truck driver in Alberta, the dock worker in British Columbia loading grain ships, the bakery worker in New York or Toronto. When trade patterns shift abruptly, capital can move. Workers, their families, and their communities cannot move so easily. A rational economic system, one organized around human need, not private profit, would handle these realities very differently. If a decision had to be made to restructure grain trade, it would begin with democratic participation by those affected. Workers in mills and ports, farmers organized in cooperatives, consumer groups concerned about food prices and quality, all of them would be at the table. They would debate the pros and cons of different arrangements, how much to export, on what terms, how to protect jobs, how to maintain price stability for consumers. If some restructuring were still necessary, say to diversify away from overdependence on a single market, it would be accompanied by guarantees, job transitions, income security, community investment. Instead, in capitalism, the process is almost the reverse. The decisions are made first in private by political and corporate elites. They are justified afterward to the public with appeals to patriotism, inevitability, or the wisdom of the market. When costs emerge, and they always do, they are treated as unfortunate but unavoidable side effects. Workers losing jobs become statistics. Families facing higher bread prices are told it is inflation, as if that were some natural weather pattern, not the result of deliberate policy choices. Think about the way this Canadian-Chinese wheat deal was negotiated in less than 12 hours. Do you really believe that in the course of half a day, all the complex social implications were carefully weighed? That farmers' unions, worker organizations, consumer advocates, environmental groups were consulted in any serious way? Of course not. What was weighed in those hours was the balance of risks and benefits for the Canadian state and the major economic players it serves. Would this anger Washington? Yes, but Washington had already escalated with tariffs. Would this secure a lucrative outlet for Canadian grain? Yes, and at a premium price. Would it demonstrate Canadian independence in a way that plays well domestically? Yes, standing up to a bullying U.S. president is good politics, so the deal was done. From a Marxian perspective, the speed of this decision is not a sign of efficiency. It is a sign of unaccountable power. The people who will live with the consequences for years, perhaps decades, had no effective voice in the matter. The very same is true on the U.S. side. How much input did American workers have into the tariff decision? None. At best, certain interest groups, agribusiness lobbies, political donors were heard. Millions of people whose lives depend on affordable food and stable jobs were simply not part of the conversation. And here we confront another core feature of capitalism, the separation of economics from politics in theory versus their fusion in practice. We are told a comforting story in which markets handle the economy efficiently, scientifically, guided by supply and demand, while democratic politics happens in parliaments and congresses where citizens vote and deliberate. But when you look at this wheat episode, you see exactly the opposite. Markets do not float above politics. They are constantly being shaped, constrained, and redirected by political decisions made in the interests of powerful classes. Tariffs, sanctions, trade pacts, currency arrangements, these are all political tools that structure what the market even is. The illusion that markets are neutral and autonomous serves a purpose. It hides responsibility. When your grocery bill rises sharply because wheat prices spiked after a diplomatic spat, you are encouraged to think of it as an unfortunate market fluctuation or a mysterious force called inflation. The role of specific political decisions, tariffs, retaliatory deals, strategic reorientations disappears behind that fog. By contrast, a critical perspective forces us to track the chain, from Trump's tariff to Canada's pivot, to China to wheat price spikes, to milk cost increases, to bakery price hikes, to your shopping cart. Now, some might say, isn't Canada just doing what you yourself would recommend, which is to reduce its dependence on the U.S.? Isn't that a positive thing? It depends on what criteria you use. If the sole objective is to give Canadian capitalists more room to maneuver to ensure that they are not entirely subject to U.S. policy mood swings, then yes, from their standpoint, pivoting to China is rational. If the objective, however, is to build an economy that serves the needs and aspirations of working people in Canada and beyond, then tying yourself more closely to another major capitalist power with its own authoritarian impulses and corporate interests does not solve the underlying problem. It simply swaps one axis of dependence for another. The same is true for China. Many people, especially in the global South, understandably see China as a counterweight to U.S. dominance, and in some cases that can open space for more independent development. But we should not romanticize. Chinese firms and the Chinese state behave as capitalist actors in these deals. They are securing supplies, profits, and leverage, not building a democratic, worker-controlled global food system. When they pay above market prices for Canadian wheat, that is an investment in future bargaining power. It might temporarily benefit Canadian producers, but it also deepens a relationship in which both sides' working classes remain excluded from real control. What this wheat story highlights is that we live in a world of competing capitalisms, not a world dividing neatly into capitalism and some humane alternative. American capitalism, Canadian capitalism, Chinese capitalism, they each have their particular institutional forms, histories, and ideological covers, but they share the same basic structure: a minority at the top, owners, major shareholders, political elites, control the key means of production and make the major economic decisions. The majority work for a wage, have little or no say in those decisions, and absorb the shocks when things go wrong. That is why, for me, the most important lesson to draw from this episode is not Canada was smart, or Trump blundered, or China is clever. It is that leaving something as fundamental as the global food system in the hands of profit-driven corporations and the governments that serve them is a recipe for repeated crises. Whether the center of gravity is Washington, Ottawa, or Beijing, as long as the basic class structure remains intact, capital on top, labor below, we will see versions of this drama play out again and again. Let me bring this down to the level of your daily life once more, because otherwise this can sound abstract. Imagine you are a young worker in the United States just getting by. Your wages have barely kept up with the cost of rent, health care, and transportation. You go to the supermarket and notice that bread is more expensive, pasta is creeping up in price, your favorite cereal costs more. You are told on the news that inflation is finally coming down, but your lived reality is that key items are still painfully high. Tucked behind those price tags is this entire chain of events we've been discussing: tariffs, retaliatory trade deals, speculation in commodity markets, strategic pacts between governments. Now imagine you are a farmer in Western Canada. For years, you sold grain into a relatively stable North American system. You might not have loved all aspects of it, the power of big grain companies, the squeeze on farm incomes, but you at least had predictable buyers. Overnight, your main government announces a sweeping shift. New contracts, new buyers, new standards, new delivery routes. Maybe, in the short term, the prices you receive look better. But you also worry. What happens if relations with China sour? What if this premium disappears? What if being locked into this arrangement cuts you off from other markets in the future? None of these long-term questions were genuinely debated in public before the pact was signed. Or take a worker in a Chinese flour mill or a food processing plant. For them, guaranteed supplies of Canadian wheat might bring more stability. Their bosses will have confidence in inputs, maybe invest in expanding production, but they too have zero say in the broader strategy. If geopolitical tensions rise and the flow of grain is suddenly interrupted, they will be the ones facing layoffs, wage cuts, or factory closures. Once again, decisions made thousands of miles away in languages they may not even speak will shape their livelihoods. This is why I keep returning in my work to the question of democracy in the workplace and in the economy as a whole. As long as enterprises are organized in the traditional capitalist way, hierarchically, with owners and top managers making decisions and workers following orders, our societies will remain vulnerable to the kind of crisis we are seeing in the wheat market. True democracy cannot end at the doors of the factory, the farm, or the office. If it does, then what we call political democracy is constantly undermined by economic power. Just think how different this situation might look if the major stakeholders in the wheat system were worker cooperatives rather than capitalist corporations. A cooperative of Canadian grain farmers, democratically run, would think very carefully about signing away 40% of its exportable production to a single foreign buyer, even at a premium price. Members would ask, how does this affect our long-term autonomy? What safeguards are there if the political winds shift? Similarly, worker-owned mills in the US and China would have strong incentives to coordinate, to seek stable, mutually beneficial arrangements rather than volatile, zero-sum deals driven by nationalistic posturing. Of course, we do not live in that world yet. We live in a world where Trump can, with a stroke of a pen or the tap of a smartphone, unleash a tariff that ricochets through the global food system, and where Canadian and Chinese elites can, over a hurried video call, reshape a fundamental trade relationship. That is why episodes like this one are valuable teaching moments. They reveal, in a concentrated way, the irrationality and injustice built into capitalism. They show how an economic system that prides itself on efficiency and rational allocation can, in fact, be rocked by impulsive political gestures and short-term calculations. In the coming period, you will see many pundits and politicians try to frame this as a narrow technical issue. Some will say the problem is Trump's style, his impulsiveness. Others will say the problem is Canada's disloyalty or China's aggressiveness. A few will call for better coordination or a return to rules-based trade under one or another international body. What almost none of them will do is question the underlying class structure that makes these kinds of shocks inevitable. They will not ask why the people who grow the wheat, mill the flour, bake the bread, and buy the food have so little control over the system that governs all of that. But that is exactly the question we have to ask if we want not merely to interpret these events, but to change the conditions that produce them. Now, let us step back and look at the broader historical trajectory, because you cannot understand this wheat deal or the tariffs that provoked it if you only look at the events of the last few weeks. What we are witnessing here is a classic symptom of a system in decline. When an economic empire like the United States begins to lose its absolute dominance, it thrashes. It attempts to use political force, tariffs, sanctions, threats, to maintain an economic position that it can no longer hold purely by market competition. And what is the result? The dialectic of history is cruel. The very measures taken to secure American dominance, imposing tariffs on Canadian allies, threatening trade wars, have produced the exact opposite result. They have pushed Canada, a resource giant, into the waiting arms of the rising competitor, China. This is the contradiction of capitalism in its late imperial phase. Trump acts to make America great, to protect the domestic economy, but the structure of the global market is already so integrated, so fragile, that his protectionist blow does not protect. It shatters. It shatters the North American solidarity that U.S. capital relied upon for decades. And who picks up the pieces? China. Not because China is benevolent, but because Chinese state capitalism is currently in a phase of expansion, hungry for exactly the resources, food, energy, minerals that the United States is carelessly tossing aside. The irony should not be lost on anyone. The America First policy has just handed the food security of the Pacific over to Beijing. But I want to warn you against falling into the trap of viewing this as a wrestling match between nations. It is easy to watch the news and think Canada won this round, or the US lost, or China is the new master. That is the narrative they want you to consume because it hides the class reality. If you are a working class person in Chicago or Detroit facing higher bread prices because the North American market has been broken, you did not lose to China. You lost to a class of leaders, political and corporate, who treat your livelihood as a gambling chip. If you are a Canadian worker, you did not win. You have simply been traded from one master to another. Your labor, your natural resources are now pledged to the stability of the Chinese market rather than the American one. The boss has changed, but the relationship of exploitation remains exactly the same. And this brings us to the core Marxist insight that is so often missing from mainstream commentary. The problem is not bad trade deals. The problem is that the production and distribution of the fundamental necessities of life, wheat, corn, energy, are organized for profit, not for human need. Why did Canada sign this pact in 12 hours? Because the profit imperative demanded it. The grain traders, the logistics companies, the agribusiness giants, they needed a secure market to realize their surplus value. They could not afford to wait for Washington to come to its senses. They followed the money, and the state, as it always does in a capitalist society, acted as the committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. When workers make decisions, they prioritize stability, community health, and mutual survival. They do not treat food as a geopolitical weapon. They treat it as food. The irrationality of this wheat crisis, where food exists but is locked away by contracts and tariffs, is a direct result of the capitalist form of organization. We have the technology to feed everyone. We have the logistics. What we don't have is the social organization. We are using a 19th century system of private property and nation state competition to manage a 21st century global economy. And it is breaking. Let this moment be a lesson. When you see the prices rise at your local supermarket, do not blame inflation as if it were a weather event. Do not blame the Chinese worker or the Canadian farmer. Blame a system that allows a handful of men in suits to play poker with the world's calorie supply. Blame a system that divorces the people who do the work from the decisions that shape their lives. The Canada-China Wheat Pact is not an anomaly. It is a preview of the future under capitalism, a future of trade wars, resource hoarding, and instability. The only way out is to change the system itself. We need democracy at work. We need an economy that serves the many, not the profits of the few. That is the fight before us.